So, Mr. Browder, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Now, you're in Strasbourg for a campaign called Political Prisoners Ordered to Die. It's quite a grim title. What is this campaign about, and what do you hope to achieve here?
Basically, Putin has taken a number of political prisoners in Russia. Some of them are people that I'm close to. Specifically, a young man named Vladimir Kara-Murza is facing 24 years in prison for basically calling Putin a war criminal. We also have Mikhail Saakashvili, who's in prison in Georgia under a Russian-influenced government. He is slowly being tortured to death in prison. And so there's a number of these people, and what I'm here to do today is to energize the European Parliament and the European Commission to fight for these people. It's one thing to provide weapons for Ukraine, and very important, but it's another thing to provide support for those who are standing up to Putin or have stood up to Putin, so that they understand that there's somebody who has their back. And that's what I'm trying to do here today.
Okay. And what is the response been to that? Are you here in the Parliament?
The response is extremely robust. We're in a world right now where it's just it's an issue of bandwidth. People there's so many terrible things happening that nobody knows what to pay attention to. And so it's very important when you have this young man, 41 years old, facing 24 years in prison for nothing, that people pay attention and do something about it. And so the response has been robust. Now the big question is, even with a robust response from the European Union, and the robust response would be sanctions, personal sanctions, Magnitsky sanctions, freezing the assets and banning the visas. Even if we do that, it's not necessarily going to change anything, because Russia right now is sort of quickly moving towards a North Korea type of situation where they've been so heavily sanctioned that it's hard to know how an additional sanction is going to change their behavior.
That's interesting. Now, you mentioned sanctions. I mean, you've personally been for years, of course, been trying to really mobilize the international community to inflict, really maximum financial pain on Vladimir Putin and his associates. Now with the war in Ukraine, we have that. For the first time, we have these very far-reaching, unprecedented sanctions imposed both by the EU and the US. But do you think they've had an impact? And what kind of an impact?
The sanctions have been utterly devastating for Putin and the Russian economy. You shouldn't believe a word that you read coming out of Russia about their economic statistics. It's just outright, plain lies. The Russian economy is a shadow of its former self. Almost all Western companies have pulled out. Nearly half the country's central bank reserves have been frozen. You have almost every Russian bank can't do business with Western banks. Some of the most productive people have left the country. They can barely make any of the industrial goods they made before because they're missing parts. It's a total economic disaster. So anybody who says the sanctions aren't working are listening to Russian propaganda. Sanctions are working. However, there are still huge loopholes in the sanctions regime. The first and most important loophole is that we continue to buy Russian oil and gas, and we continue to send them hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion a day for their oil and gas. And as long as we do that, that gives Putin enough money to continue to fund a war to kill Ukrainians. And we have to find a way to stop that. These the price caps and things like that, which have been agreed, are not nearly enough. We need to completely and absolutely stop the flow of money to Russia, and that means stop the purchase of oil and gas.
And how should the West do that? I mean, what do you propose?
Well, first of all, we should just put an embargo on Russia. Simple. No beating around the bushes. And we should also enforce an embargo on countries that are currently not cooperating. We should say that if you do business with Russia, we're not going to do business with you. We've got to get tough. If we don't get tough, it's going to be a very long war, and this war is going to cause us much more problems in the future.
But then are you also referring to countries outside the West, countries like China and India, which continue to do business with Russia, continue to buy oil? They're not part of the sanctions regime. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think you could start with some of the smaller countries. Turkey. Turkey is busy evading sanctions on behalf of Russia on a daily basis. They're not a strong country. They're a weak economy. They should be told, get into line here. South Africa, the United Arab Emirates, Indonesia. There's a lot of countries that continue to do business with Russia that are not superpower economies, that we have the economic leverage to push into our camp. We haven't used it, we should.
Okay. I want to also ask you about the role of Western nations. I mean, you've written extensively about President Putin and his money men. You've written about the Russian oligarchs, these kind of murky financial structures that set up all the money that they've held in many Western capitals. Do you think Western nations like, let's say, Switzerland or the UK have done enough to really kind of squeeze and stop the flow of this Russian money?
Well, I think that Switzerland has definitely not done enough. Switzerland is continuing to be the sort of safe haven for dirty Russian money. According to the Swiss Bankers Association, more than $200 billion of Russian money is in Swiss banks. And as far as I'm aware, only about $7 billion of that has been frozen. So why not the other 193? I also know that the Swiss government is effectively cooperating with Russian criminals. We have a situation in our own case where $20 million was frozen of money connected to Russian gangsters, connected to the murder of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. And the Swiss government is sending back about 80% of that money to the Russian criminals.
Why is that?
Because they have a dysfunctional system, but it's the same stuff always. Why did they take the Nazi gold, et cetera? It's a history. Switzerland is a dirty country when it comes to Russian money. They've done very little to fix that. It's a big problem.
Okay. And do you think, I mean, you've talked about how the Russian oligarchs have so many billions in Western capitals. Do you think the sanctions have really gotten to that wealth? There's been a lot of coverage about, seizing a villa in southern France or a yacht here. But do you think we're still scratching the surface, or has it really gotten to that money?
Well, the sanctions have definitely gotten to the oligarchs. Once you put a person on the sanctions list, their life is completely destroyed. They can't open a bank account, they can't get a credit card, they can't get visas to most countries. It's not good. Having said that, these oligarchs, most of them, almost all of them, made their money dishonestly, and they always knew that someday someone was going to come for their money. And so they put their money into different structures and people and proxies and relatives and so on. And so for every oligarch, there's a whole constellation of people who are helping them evade sanctions. And so the next step in this whole Western sanctions program is to go after the sanctions evaders, after the enablers, the people helping them evade their sanctions. That's a really important part of the future crackdown on Putin and his oligarchs.
And by enablers, do you mean Western accountants, lawyers?
Bankers, lawyers, real estate agents, family members, trust companies, all sorts of different people involved in helping oligarchs carry on living a rich life when they've been put on the sanctions list.
There's been a lot of debate in the European Union about seizing frozen Russian assets and using that to help with Ukraine's eventual reconstruction, but using it now to help, let's say, internally displaced people in Ukraine. Now, it's a legally fraught issue. There are kind of divided opinions on this, but what are your thoughts on this issue?
There shouldn't be a debate at all. Putin has caused $1.2 trillion of damage to Ukraine. We've frozen $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves. Putin broke it. He should fix it. Now, the issue is that this money is held by the state of Russia, and it's protected by something called sovereign immunity. And sovereign immunity means you can't touch the embassy and you can't touch their central bank reserves. So here you've got Putin redefining international crime, invading, killing, destroying, and then he's protected by international law. What has to happen is we need to amend international law to adjust it to these spectacular international crimes that are being committed. And that there shouldn't be a debate at all. This should only be a question about how quickly are we going to amend the law on sovereign immunity so that money can be confiscated and used for the victims in Ukraine.
But, my question is, does freezing this money eventually matter? And unfortunately, we've seen President Putin continue with his war in Ukraine. It continues to grind on. We're in the second year. He seems to show no sign of really reversing course. Does freezing that money really help? Is that going to stop the war, you think?
Freezing the money is not going to stop the war by itself, but you have to understand, with Russia's running out of ammunition. How do they get more ammunition? They spend money. If you cut off their money, they can't buy as much ammunition. And so the idea is to starve them of the financial resources to do this. And just because we're saying, well, he continues to fight this war, he may be using economic resources that should be used for pensioners. We don't know where he's getting the money, but what we do know is that money funds wars. And if we can cut off the money, then hopefully at some point we can cut off his ability to fund this war.
And coming to the war, I mean, we have to also talk about how this could eventually end. Now, you've known President Putin personally. Nobody knows what he's thinking, but what do you think is the end game for him here? How do you see this playing out? How is this going to end?
I know how Putin behaves very well because I've been fighting with him man to man for 13 years. He never compromises. He never backs down. He never negotiates. All he does is escalate. So my full expectation is that whenever we think he's been defeated in one area, he just doubles down or triples down. And so there's only two ways this war can end. It either ends with his victory in Ukraine, and then I guarantee you he'll move on to other countries, or it ends with the Ukrainians' victory, pushing Russian soldiers out of their territory. And if that happens, then Putin probably loses power and loses his life.
So the only way out of this is for Ukraine to win, essentially.
The only way out is for Ukraine, for total victory for Ukraine, a total defeat for Russia. Russia needs to lose and to be seen to lose. And if that were to happen, then we have a situation where we can move on to a peaceful future in Europe. If that doesn't happen, we've got a lot of nasty stuff coming down the pike.
And just a last question, I mean, what would happen once the war does end? I mean, how important is it to, ensure justice and accountability for Russian war crimes? I mean, you are somebody who, you created the Magnitsky Act, you have pursued this path of, using this act to go after individuals who have committed human rights abuses, Russian individuals. How important do you think this issue is after the war? Justice
is absolutely crucial. We cannot allow the criminals, the war criminals, the murderers, the rapists, the genocide pursuers to get away with it. Justice has to be done. There needs to be reparations, there needs to be war crimes tribunals, and there needs to be a full recognition of that this was a criminal act, and anyone who commits a criminal act will face justice.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time.